by Brian Nell, who is CEO of Rise Against Hunger Africa. Very good evening to you. Thank you so much for joining us and welcome.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for having me, and good evening to you and your viewers.
Thank you so much. I mean, this is a worrying picture, Brian. The latest data pointing that nearly 1 in 4 South African children are living in severe food poverty. How close are we now to a full-blown child nutrition emergency as we take stock of these latest figures?
Well, I think probably the most concerning thing is that hunger in general within South Africa is on the increase, which is a huge concern. The government is taking some steps, and I know it's been forefront on our president's mind during some of his latest, nation addresses. But yeah, there's a lot to be done, and it is critical, and it's very urgent.
Yeah. And we often speak about hunger, but there's also malnutrition, which is different. Can you explain why a child may have enough to eat yet still suffer from malnutrition as we try to get a full picture of the impact on the ground?
Yeah, I mean, I think you I think you mentioned that there's a big difference between hunger and malnutrition. You could feed, someone with a couple of bread rolls and they're no longer hungry, but they haven't got the nutritional sort of value out of that meal that they need. And it's very critical during the developmental years of a child's life. And so we also have the statistic of 1 in 4 children are born developmentally stunted in South Africa. And so that tracks back to that sort of first 1,000 days. So it's from conception to the age of 2. And the challenge is, a developmentally stunted child can just not compete with their peers. The chances of them finishing high school is very slim, which means no tertiary education options. And so you end up in this perpetual cycle of poverty. So it's really critical to address it specifically in those foundation sort of years of a child's life.
Why do you think child hunger remains so persistent in South Africa despite years of intervention and partnerships and, looking at the school feeding systems and social grants, and we still find ourselves as a country in such a position?
Well, so the school feeding system would only kick in from sort of grade 1, and I think there's got to be a lot more focus shifted to those foundation years, that 1 to 6, and even prior to that, during the pregnancy stage, and the the problem is, there's so many unregistered early childhood development centers out there. So they're not receiving any grants from the government or from the Department of Basic Education. And so they rely on, sort of 350 Rand a month school fees. A lot of the ladies that are operating these centers do it out of sort of an act to help out perhaps their own children or grandchildren and their neighbors' children. So there's also no sort of qualified foundation phase training going on. So I think that's where our main sort of challenge is, those foundation years.
So, your organization, Rise Against Hunger, has worked with thousands of communities across the continent. What have you learned about the solutions that genuinely break the cycle of hunger rather than being reactive, simply responding to the crisis?
The hunger the hunger situation is actually very complicated. So, we tend to focus a lot on sort of trying to relieve the immediate situation and provide nutrition to children during their foundation years. We have a whole program where, the feeding the children every day is one of the biggest expenses. So by receiving these donated meals, they're able to use some of the funding into improving the educational environment. So it's about linking nutrition and education. But it gets bigger than that. It's also about you know, creating sort of sustainable food sources for various communities. Um, and yeah, I think there's a lot of organizations in South Africa that are really working on it, but a lot more needs to be done, and we need to sort of really come together and work together with government to try and make a really meaningful impact.
As you talk about, the importance of collaboration, how important is community involvement from business, ordinary South Africans in addressing food insecurity? And of course, perhaps the role of the private sector. What should it look like?
Well, you know, I must say, we totally funded by the private sector, by corporates, and I think corporate South Africa have really stepped up over the years. You know, it's no longer a case of making your annual donation for your tax certificate. You know, many of the many corporates these days have whole CSI departments, and they're focused on certain areas, and they really get involved with the charities and help the charities sort of to continue to do their work. And yeah, I mean, our organization, you know, we rely on, as I say, corporate donations and volunteers to help us to pack our meals. So we're a very volunteer-driven organization, and I think, yeah, corporate South Africa and individuals are very giving of their time and their funding to try and address the situation. But the challenge is huge. I think that's the biggest problem.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for speaking to us this evening. And of course, really just bringing to the forefront a very important topic, South Africa grappling with a deepening child hunger crisis and the role that ordinary citizens can play. And of course, the very important role of the private sector in assisting and ensuring that children are fed nutritious meals. That was Brian Nell, CEO of Rise Against Hunger Africa.